So I grew up as a little girl going to the Amon Carter Museum of Western Art in Fort Worth. You know, field trips and with family, and then in college and graduate school. And like a lot of kind of regional museums, small private museums, it was really built around the collection of the founder, who was Amon Carter, who's a wealthy Texan and who founded the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, and who in 1935 bought his first two pieces of art from Charles Russell and Frederick Remington. And if those two names don't mean anything to you, just think cowboys and Indians, because that's pretty much the whole museum, cowboys and Indians, in very stylized, kind of romanticized kind of the way European people would picture native people, right? But the museum kind of started to change because it was actually opened a few years after his death, and his daughter kind of stepped in and took over, and she had kind of East Coast sensibilities and probably didn't, you know, think Western sounded all that great, so they dropped the name Western Art. It was just the Amon Carter Museum. And as the museum went around, it began to evolve. And one of my all-time favorite exhibits ever was there in the 80s, Lord Gilpin, who was a photographer who died in 1979, but she photographed the Navajo and the Pueblo who she lived among in these just unbelievably beautiful, sensitive ways, right? A very, very, very different way of picturing Native people than, you know, Charles Russell and Frederick Remington, right? But it was still a white person picturing the other. Well, now, if you go to the Amon Carter Museum, which has now changed the name again to Amon Carter Museum of American Art, let me just say that American means everybody, okay? And if you look at the last 15 or 20 years of their exhibits, it's really remarkable how they are centering the art of people whose voices have often been left out. I mean, like, you look through the catalog and how you could look on a museum website and it shows you past exhibitions, and every single one you're like, oh my God, that would have been a great fun thing for Peace Church to do. I mean, just really widening and widening and broadening, you know, what it means to live in this country in a really powerful, evocative way, the way artists are able to do, people like me can't do, who don't have that gift, right? So I was not surprised, really, to see that the Amon Carter had this exhibit on emancipation, the unfinished project of liberation, which I think is such a great title. And when we saw the exhibit in June, it was really a remarkable thing. You know, like I said, the author, the artist, Ward, John Quincy Adams Ward, was an Ohioan who was born about 1830, had these abolition sentiments, and interestingly enough, almost must have been like before the ink was dry, or maybe after the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation in September of 1862, he got going on this piece of art, and then it was produced, and the first showing was in April, and then in June there was actually the bronze. And while it is not as well known as like the picture of Lincoln freeing the slaves, it is really significant for a couple of reasons. One, it is one of the very first bronze sculptures in this country of a black person. And two, is so different from like the Lincoln thing where you got your white liberator, right? And where you've got your slave underneath kind of pleading for freedom. Or if you think of, you know, again, kind of if you can pull up from American history or art history, there are kind of like those abolition medallions, or, you know, kind of the early sketches of slaves often kind of begging on their knees, begging and pleading for their freedom. This guy, he's not begging and pleading, okay? And he didn't have a white liberator. And Ward, I mean, this is remarkable to me. In 1863, the artist said, you know, this person has been freed by his own will. And though there is still a long way to go for this individual, I like to show that there is hope in its undertaking. I mean, it's just kind of like a remarkable thing. And when you look at this piece of artwork, which is only 20 inches high and was never made into a giant statue, it causes you to think a little bit more about history and like what the Emancipation Proclamation really meant. Remember the Emancipation Proclamation? January of 1863, freed the slaves who were in Confederate territory, and it didn't make it to Texas, right, until Juneteenth, until June 19th, 1865, when it finally made it down there. But it makes you think about the role black people played in their own freedom. And it makes you think about how our minds can even change and stretch. And so many scholars have pointed out the Emancipation Proclamation in many ways was Lincoln's response to the slaves demanding their freedom. So what was happening at that point was that black folks who were running from the plantation and fighting their freedom were going to the Union camps, they were going to the Union Army lines, and the generals were saying to Lincoln, what are we going to do with all these people? And so in the initial Emancipation Proclamation in September of 1862, Lincoln actually had an idea of colonization, of sending African Americans back to other places, and he had nothing about blacks being able to be in the Union Army. By January of 1863, he's got what? A whole section in there on black folks being in the Union Army. I mean, so even Lincoln's ideas about what it meant to be an American and what it meant to be in this country were evolving and changing. So you've got this incredible piece of art, which when you look at it, it makes you think sort of in a way, not of a pleading, begging, weak person who's in need of liberation, sort of makes you think of The Thinker, that Rodin piece. That's exactly, although that was done 20 years later, but that's what I thought when I saw that. It's like this person, you can see this person with the depths of who they are. They're not demanding for someone to be freed, to free them. And I thought, looking at that, I thought of faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Because that word assurance comes from the Greek hypostasis, which means your very being. At your very being, this person knows I am free. I am created in God's image. And that phrase shows up earlier in Hebrews 1 in this beautiful passage where we're told that Jesus is the hypostasis. Jesus is the imprint of God. Jesus is the, image of God. And I was thinking about that, what does that mean for us to understand, for this person to understand? I am the imprint of God. I am the face of God. Nobody else out there is telling me who I am, right? Just this incredible strength. And then hope, it's the conviction of things not seen. And you can see this, he's almost looking kind of off and back and forward at the same time. It's like conviction of things not seen, like up ahead, somewhere up there, there's something else. I mean, the shackle's still on him, folks. I mean, you know what I mean? There's a long way to go. I mean, when that Emancipation Proclamation was released, 2.5 years before people knew they were free, right? But he can see it up ahead. He can see something up ahead, something more than what I see right here. I mean, do you see the power and the strength in that? The individual, and I love, my whole theology, 100%, we're created in the image of God. I think about that every morning when I run. Maybe now, not having kids in the house is quieter. I think about it throughout the day. When I go on my run in the morning and I pass people, I think, honest to God, that person is the imprint of God, right? I mean, it's not just John Sherman who owns the Royals. It's the person asking for food out front and the person asking for a fair wage, right? What does it mean to think every single person is the imprint of God? Every single person. Every person you pass, even the people we deplore, who Supreme Court justices who are flying all over the world and taking these extravagant trips and really? That didn't impact your, really? But somehow is the imprint of God, right? But not alone. This person is not alone. And what's fascinating about this piece of art, like I said, there are 8 castings of it, but the Amon Carter has 2 interesting things about their own casting. One is it has a key. There's a key that can unlock the shackles. And the second is it's inscribed to the 54th Regiment of the black soldiers, the very first volunteer black soldiers from Massachusetts. And while it's not totally confirmed, they believe this was cast and kind of was a commission by, is it Bessie Fremont, kind of the famous abolitionist family in Boston, and that it was actually made from cannonballs and from materials at Fort Wagner, which is where so many of those black soldiers died. This guy is not alone, right? He is not alone. He is standing there. He is looking there. He is looking out with 200,000 black soldiers who came and volunteered to fight in the Union Army. 200,000 black Americans. 200,000 black Americans, 180,000 in the Army, 20,000 in the Navy. When people were running for their lives, paying off other people, 200,000 black Americans. And that regiment, who were they led by? You know, that 25-year-old white guy, Robert Gould Shaw. I mean, is that not amazing to you? Oh, it gets discouraging. It's a discouraging time, isn't it? Really? It's discouraging. You know, things aren't really going the way I like, and you know, look at the backwards view. Do you think things have like been great in this country all this time, right? People fought and died to try to keep their slaves, people. I mean, you know, this is so we step up. And then the beautiful, beautiful words in Hebrews that remind us we're not alone, that say to us that we're anchored in God. That's the whole theology of Hebrews. This Jesus is anchored in the heavens, and then Jesus comes and he suffers with us and he goes back into heaven. But along that cord, there's this cloud of witnesses. Along that cord, there are all these people. And when you read Hebrews 11, you think it's just like a long listing of everybody who is in the Old Testament. No, it's a group of people who are righteous. What I love about these lists of people who are righteous in the scripture, they're never all that special. Like the very first person is Abel. What did Abel do? Remember, he was Cain's brother. The only thing he did was get killed. That's all that he did. And then in Hebrews, they said, you know, Abel, and he still speaks. He never freaking said a word. You know, he just like said nothing, right? But somehow Abel is this righteous guy. And then you go to Noah, and we've talked about Noah before, really Noah and all that. And other rabbis were like, what was special about, you know, Noah? He didn't even try to fight for the other neighbors, right? And then you've got the people who journeyed, like Abraham and Sarah, which reminds us what? Of all the people in our own lives, right? How did my people get to Texas? They started in Switzerland. Another one started in Chattanooga and went to New York, and then, you know, Detroit and Illinois. And why are we fascinated with that? Why are we all fascinated with our stories? Because it says to us that somewhere someone was seeking something better and more. And then the third group in this cloud of witnesses are those who suffered. And that's where we can really identify with the book of Hebrews, because we know something about that, all of us, right? We know something about the suffering, the hurt, the pain of life. And then from there, you know, we're just kind of swept up into this, where do we take our place? How do we kind of stand in that line? And how is it that we're all needed? I mean, the scripture says that these people would not be perfected without us. Like, it's not just us looking back, it's people looking forward. So the Amon Carter did a wonderful job with this exhibit. They didn't just show this statue. They showed the statue with other statues kind of from a similar time. And then they had a gallery with 7 different artists, black artists, who were all responding in different ways to what liberation means, to the ongoing, unfinished work of liberation. So there was a young man who had taken stools from a prison cell, from the waiting room where he had visited his father so much and made art out of it. There was a woman whose father was in the Black Panthers, and she had gotten his declassified, you know, papers about her father, and then she'd added, you know, Hello Kitty, you know, decals to it and glitter and made this beautiful thing. And then there's the woman who took the beautiful tissue paper and made this gorgeous quilt. I mean, all of those people saying to us, this is our ongoing work. When President Biden signed the declaration 2 years ago, June 2021, making Juneteenth a federal holiday, he had a treasure from Fort Worth right by him. And it wasn't this statue. It was a woman named Opal Lee, who was 94 at the time, who is considered the grandmother of Juneteenth. Opal was born in Marshall, Texas in 1926. Her parents' home burned to the ground right before they moved to Fort Worth. Her parents were hard workers. They bought a house that was in an area that had traditionally been kind of a white area in Fort Worth. And in 1939, on June 19th, 500 white people, men, came and burned their house to the ground. And her parents never talked about it, and they kept going. Opal became a teacher in Fort Worth. She touched so many lives. Then she became an educator, like in the junior college system. And mainly, she has been like this incredible voice for change in the city. She's been on the Habitat Board, and she's worked for, you know, homeless issues and fair wage groups. And her main passion has been Juneteenth. That has been her main thing. Grew up celebrating it. And so maybe, I don't know, 30 years ago, she started doing a 2.5-mile hike every year on Juneteenth as a way of remembering the 2.5 years from the time of the Emancipation Proclamation until it made it to Texas. And when she was 89 in 2016, she decided she'd waited long enough and she was going to walk to Washington, D.C. to see that Juneteenth became a holiday. So she set out. She was going to walk 2.5 miles every day. She talked to her pastor, she talked to her church, she talked to the musicians at the church, had all these people with her. She walked 2.5 miles. The next day she walked another 2.5 miles. She kept going until, sadly, she got kind of stopped by the politics of that really rancorous presidential election. So then she just went to places that really invited her she went to Colorado Springs, she went to Atlanta, she went all over, and she arrived in January of 2017 to ask President Obama to make Juneteenth a holiday, but as we all know, now there was a new president. So she didn't give up. She kept on going. And 2 years ago, she was right there by Joe Biden when he signed the piece of legislation. And she hadn't stopped. She's kept going now at 97. Now her new idea is that we'll go from June 19th to July 4th, and we'll just have 2 weeks of celebrating, 2 weeks of saying, what does it mean to be people of faith? What does it mean to be people of God? And she keeps saying over and over again, what does it mean to know that none of us are free until all of us are free? What does it mean every single day to wake up and think, what an incredible privilege to be on this planet at this time? I mean, there's no shortage of challenges, is there? Pick your cause, right? What does it mean to think that we're standing in this line of people who had no hope of freedom, right? No hope of freedom, and they kept going. What does it mean to think we stood with people who knew women wouldn't get the vote, and they kept working at it, right? So we stand in this place surrounded by this beautiful crowd of witnesses, thankful as ever that we are, each one, everyone, the imprint of God. Amen.